Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Rusky, and joining me today is Peg Rowe.
Hello.
Today is another Tiara Talk. We are talking about International Women's Month, celebrating women and the right to work. And it led Peg and I to start thinking about all the different choices that women we admire have made over their lifetime. And, some have chose to work out of the home, some have not chose to work out of the home. But it was just, it caused us a few moments of wonderful reflection. And
Yep.
so today we're going to just talk about really asking us all to take a moment and think about the role models in our lives, the women in particular, role models in our lives, and what it is that, they've actually shared with us by living their life intentionally and by the choices that they've made, and how it's affected you. So
Mhm.
that's our thought for today.
Yep.
Peg, would you like to start out and,
Sure.
share? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the women that I admire is not a woman that probably anybody else who watches this would ever know, but she was my first professional leader that I worked for. At the University of Missouri Medical Center, I was a dietitian in that role, and I moved to Missouri, didn't know anybody, and I worked for Mrs. Burdine Tuthill. That was her name,
Okay.
and she was
That's a
divorced.
shout out to
That's
her
a shout
and her
out to
family.
Ruby. Yes. She was divorced, but what's fascinating for me about her, to your point about choices, is that I have no idea how long ago she had gotten divorced, but she had a son who was, probably in high school at the time that I started working there, and I was just out of college. And she was raising him by herself, but she had her father living with her. So she created a multi-generational home for a couple of reasons. One, because she was committed to her son and her father, and because she wanted her son to have male role models. And she made a real point of creating opportunities for her son to have male role models. She didn't remarry, but she really felt it was important for that. So that was one aspect that she was open about. And so, in terms of making her choices, she made some very specific choices that allowed her to do that. In terms of having her as my first, boss in a professional, I mean, I certainly worked before and had other people that I worked for, but not in a professional role where I was really stepping into leadership for the first time myself. And in that environment, in an academic medical center environment, people turn over all the time.
Yeah.
Mrs. Tuthill had been there for forever, but she actually had the responsibility for developing all of us who joined the staff. I was one of three. The three, leaders who joined her team were all new, every last one of us, and none of us had led
Yeah.
in that role before. And she was such a patient role model and supporter of who we were and allowing each of us to develop and really bring our own leadership forward. She valued team. So I learned a lot of my very first lessons around delivering hard messages, working with my own multi-generational team. I had high school students to people who were close to retiring on my team.
Yes.
So, everything in between. And she was just a really great sounding board. And I learned so much from watching her and then from actually dialoguing with her. She was always available.
That's
And I
great.
know that that imprinted for me a lot of the basics of leadership that I didn't learn in school necessarily, but I learned in that environment.
That's great. And I really appreciate all we did was ask ourselves this week is think about, come to our
Yeah.
Tiara talk and think about what is it that, you can reflect on in your life. And I'm so grateful that, she popped up because, I bet it's a fond memory for you as
It's a
well.
very fond memory. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I did the same, there were a lot of people out there, in the
Yes.
public world
Yeah.
that I thought about, and then things kind of hit close to home, and
Yep.
that's when I realized that the women in my family
Mhm.
are really interesting. Like one of my grandmothers, she was a very independent woman. She was married. They had two, my mother and a brother, but they were on again, off again. They weren't divorced, but my grandfather and grandmother were on again, off again. But my grandmother worked her entire life. She had a very tough life, but she worked her entire life. And she was dedicated to making sure my mother got the best education possible.
Mm.
And you know, she raised my mom to be independent. Like my mom tells stories about things she was doing when she was 7 or 8 years old, like taking the streetcar by herself and things like that. You're like, what? You know, but she raised my mom to be very independent and valued education and worked her whole life, you know, was so proud of her pension from the telephone company. That's what, you know, she was happy about. And so, of course, that impacted on my mother. So, as I think about that, now generational, I'm thinking about my mother. And my mother, I didn't realize till quite recently that she actually started at college. She went to college for a while, a short period of time, but she and my father got married very young, and she got pregnant right away after getting married. So she left school. And so her choice was to not work outside the house, but to actually
Yeah.
raise a big family. And she did go back to work though when some of us younger ones were, you know, kind of at the age where we could start coming home
Yeah.
from school ourselves. And then she went back. She was working part time, but then she went back and she was a secretary in an insurance company. And then she went and got her insurance license, and she became an agent to sell insurance and to deliver
Wow.
insurance. And she worked for years, even after my father retired. You know, she was still
Yeah.
working. And she raised us to be independent thinkers, you know, like
Yeah.
to choose our path. So, you know, I think about the choices my husband and I made, and, you know, we got married early, but you know, I knew I wanted a career, but I wasn't sure I really wanted a family. If my sons are watching this, they'll be like, "What? You didn't want us, mom?" Not early on, no. And I had a great career, but then my husband and I were faced with some choices, and he chose, well, we chose together, but he chose to be the at-home, you know, parent, which really helped me, you know, advance my career and continue my success, you know, as an independent, you know, working woman. So it's interesting to kind of now connect those threads and see how that all goes together.
Yeah, that is interesting. As you're mentioning your grandmother, I'm thinking about my maternal grandmother, who was, my maternal grandmother, was someone who worked, and she was a role model for me who worked her entire life. And the thing that's fascinating is that she was an executive assistant to the CEO president of a family candy company. So they, at that time, all the big department stores had candy counters, and so
Yeah.
their company provided candy for the candy counters in California. It was in Southern California, and candy that went to making ice cream. Like if you said peppermint stick, they would provide the peppermint stick kind of thing. Um, Knowing my grandmother, she was extremely organized. And I'm betting in today's world, she would have been a leader in a very different
Yeah.
capacity. And their best friends, they called Aunt Nettie and Uncle Art. They were not related to us, but Aunt Nettie worked for the telephone company, and she was one of the few women managers in that capacity. And that was, now decades ago. And
Yeah.
so you
Yeah.
think about,
Yes.
these were role models of women who actually had really vibrant, robust careers that they valued. I
Yeah.
mean, they really valued the work that they did and the contributions that they made. So those were always kind of there for me. And I think, in my family, my dad was in the Navy, so we moved every 2 years. So my mom did not have a job outside the house because it just, the fact that we moved so often
Right.
wasn't conducive to that. But my parents definitely had the same value on education that your parents did. And it was almost like a given. I don't think we ever, as kids, questioned that we wouldn't go to
Go to
college.
college. Yeah.
That was just a given. And we
And the
went to
gift.
state schools. It was not like we went to fancy schools, but it was expected that we would just go to college because, that was seen as a good start to whatever it was that you wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, I love the stories and that we got to share them. And those of you who are watching this video, we hope you hit the pause button somewhere right now and just think about your family, your life, the people who've intersected it, and especially the women and how they've helped, you know, shape some of the choices that you've made in your life. And even think about the choices that you're influencing for future generations.
Mhm.
So thanks for doing that and have a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining us today.
Bye.